and make America great again.
Make America great again.
Make America great again.
And we will make America great again.
Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
Ronald Reagan is considered by some to be the greatest president in the history of the United States. I've always understood that to mean that people loved his version of supply-side economics, also known as trickle-down economics. Tax the rich less, and the benefits would trickle down to all of society. That's just basic economics. Well, turns out, no it's not, and also Reagan's trickle-down theory is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the many theories and agendas that Reagan pushed during his administration. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. The 8 years that followed ushered in not only the largest redistribution of wealth in a generation, but also the termination of welfare benefits for thousands of Americans, a dramatic rollback of unions and labor organizing, and an infiltration of Christian fundamentalism into American government, the consequences of which we are still very much feeling to this day. Ronald Reagan walked so that Donald Trump could run, and he altered the American way of life for everyone but the top 1%. 40 years after first being elected president, the myth of Ronald Reagan still lives on in the minds of people who are too deluded to see that the American dream Reagan stood for is the same American dream he irreversibly decimated during his time as president. This is how Reagan ruined everything. That our current levels of economic inequality and political instability are the result of a single man is hyperbolic at best, and frankly gives Reagan more credit than he deserves. Our system was fucked enough to produce and support a man like Reagan as president. He didn't just appear out of thin air. But it is hard to pinpoint another president that has had such enduring and wide-ranging negative impacts on the American way of life. I'm gonna unpack Reagan's impact by focusing on who and what he hurt, namely the middle class, minorities, and democracy. Starting with the middle class, let's talk about what Reagan is most known for: Reaganomics, a theory of supply-side economics that says that by removing regulations on businesses and lowering their taxes, they would be able to be more productive, have more freedom to be agile in the market, and that growth would then translate to more jobs and higher wages for workers. The wealth would start at the top and it would trickle down to everyone. When Reagan took office, the US was going through what was called stagflation, where both inflation and unemployment rates were high. The country was in the worst recession since the Great Depression at the time. Because of this, people were primed for major economic change, and Reagan ushered in that change. After the Great Depression, the New Deal came with huge amounts of government spending on everything from mortgage financing for whites only, more on that in my last video on housing segregation, to job creation, to building infrastructure, and these government programs were popular because they did grow the economy and create jobs and build a large, thriving middle class in America. Minimum wages stayed consistent with productivity. The more productive the average worker was, the more the minimum wage increased. That connection was broken, however, as the US tax code began moving away from the New Deal. Reagan wasn't the sole president responsible for creating tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, but he sure did it with the most gusto and to the largest degree. Before Reagan's presidency, income tax on the wealthiest Americans, that's the money that they had to pay to the government as a proportion of how much they made each year, was at 70%. So above a certain threshold, the wealthiest Americans had to pay 70% of their income to the government. By the end of Reagan's presidency, that number dropped to 28%. He also created major tax breaks for corporations and estates, all in the name of creating smaller government and putting more money in the hands of the wealthiest people and companies in the country. Some of the effects of his economic policies in the short term were positive. The period of stagflation became less pronounced, inflation and unemployment both decreased, but those numbers belie the fact that the connection between wealth and productivity was severed, and the rich got richer while the poor and middle class saw very little economic progress during this time. The incomes of the lowest 90% rose by 17%, while those of the top 10% rose by 106%. Talk about a trickle. In the years since Reagan's presidency, that gap between rich and poor has continued to widen. Today, the top 10% of income earners in the US hold 72% of the total wealth, and the bottom half of income earners, the 50% of the American population, holds 2% of the wealth. Between 1978 and 2021, average worker compensation increased 18.1%. The top CEO compensation increased 1,460% in that same time period. In 1980, the average CEO earned 36 times more money than the average worker, and today the average CEO earns 400 times more. The wealthiest have never been wealthier, while for the average worker, wages haven't even kept up with inflation. This shit ain't tricklin', Ronnie. What now? And it's not like at the time Reagan implemented trickle-down economics in the early 80s that it was this brand new, newfangled invention that everyone was optimistic about. A lot of people were like, hey, this is really gonna hurt poor people. But Ronnie was convinced by his neoliberal economic pals that keeping the wealthiest people happy will mean prosperity for all. Because Ronald Reagan was convinced that the American dream was alive and well. And the common theme through all of his policy choices was that individuals are the creators of their own destiny, that anyone could pick themselves up by their bootstraps if they really wanted to, and that any struggling was simply a moral failure on the part of the individual, and not a failing on the part of the system that stood on their necks. And it was through Reagan that this idea that the government is your enemy and stands in the way of your freedom and prosperity really took hold in the Republican consciousness writ large, to the point that working and middle-class people voted to re-elect him, even though it was actively against their own best interest to do so. Sound familiar? This was clear in his trickle-down economic policy, but it was also clear in his stance on labor rights. The 20th century saw a peak in labor unions, especially in the 40s and 50s, when over 1/3 of all workers in the US were members of a union. Unions were strong and could mount strong challenges against employers, and they brought about important labor laws like the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, child labor laws, and civil rights laws in the 1960s. During this period, Ronald Reagan himself was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a labor union for actors. At some point in the 50s, Ronald flipped from Democrat to Republican. He claimed it was because his party, the Democrats, failed him. It could also be that while he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, he granted a rare waiver to MCA, his own talent agency, to allow them to start producing television shows. They needed a waiver because it was a real conflict of interest when the people who manage talent become the people who also hire the talent. You see, after that waiver was granted, Reagan conveniently was given a cushy TV job through MCA that paid him $125,000 per year in 1950s money, and he became a walking spokesman for GE, an influencer before there were influencers. The FBI eventually investigated MCA and the waiver granted to them by the Screen Actors Guild, including Reagan, for anti-competitive behavior. Nothing came of the probe for Reagan, though MCA was forced to break up. It was around this time that Reagan conveniently was like, you know what? Fuck unions. Fuck the government. Too many regulations. I'm a Republican now. Interesting. But he, of course, used his history as a union president to his advantage while running for governor of California and later for United States president, pointing out that he was the only candidate who's actually been president of a labor union in order to win over the working class white vote. Convenient.
Where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost.
And a lot of them voted for him, which was against their self-interest. And that was made abundantly clear not long into his presidency when in 1981, PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, went on strike to demand better working conditions and increased pay. See, the problem with this is that the workers were technically federal employees, and it was against the law for federal employees to strike. Roughly half of all US flights were grounded during on the matter, and made his stance very clear.
And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
And then, 2 days later, 12,000 federal air traffic controllers lost their jobs and were barred from ever working for the federal government again. It was a show of strength that debilitated the organized labor movement, and it hasn't recovered since. Where at its peak, union membership accounted for over 1/3 of all workers in the United States, by the end of Reagan's presidency, that number was cut in half. Today, union membership accounts for roughly 10% of all workers, which is a historic low. The reason for this dramatic decrease in union members is twofold. One, Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers sent a strong message to the private sector that union busting is fair game. And two, Reagan appointed his own cronies to head the National Labor Relations Board, the federal board that oversees unions. And they worked to loosen regulations on businesses and let them get away with like nearly whatever they wanted. And the suppression of the labor movement is shown in the numbers, not only in the dwindling number of union members, but also in the dramatic decrease in strikes, a common tool used by unions to counteract the power imbalance between workers and corporations. Prior to 1979, there were on average between 200 and 400 large-scale labor strikes on any given year. There were 187 in 1980. By 1989,